Joining us once again, I have a fantastic panel, except for me. I have Odon Lafontaine, who is in France. I have JC in a secret location with his terrible Irish accent. And I have Professor Robert Kerr. And we are going to be doing a presentation by Odon on Mecca. Now, yesterday I was on with Osama and JC. We discussed from Tisdale's book on every single narrative in the Quran is sourced from Jewish legends, Christian legends, modifications of biblical tales taken from Gnostic Gospels, taken from Zoroastrian legends and religious tales, and so on. And we're going through Tisdale's book, which goes through as many of these stories as he could find a source for. And we can see this is purely just, I would call it plagiarism, though Odon might use a different word. But besides that, we've got the fact that Mecca, the Meccan narrative also doesn't hold up. And what the Quran says and what we know about Mecca, these don't jibe. So I will hand over to Odon, and everyone can make introductions and say hello. And welcome everyone. Please like, share, subscribe. And when you like, you send the video out to 10 more people. So let's do that. And over to you, Odon.
Hello everyone. Yeah, I thought it would be interesting to build up on our video series on the Jerusalem thesis. We did a series of maybe 8 or 9 videos explaining this Jerusalem thesis, that Jerusalem was the original focus point of early Islam. And Islam got sort of transformed by the caliphs, who invented a new holy city, Mecca, as a substitution, sort of a substitution for Jerusalem for many reasons. They wanted to sort of sever the ties, the connection with the biblical context of early Islam. They wanted a place that was sort of a blank page to start again without any Christian or Jewish influence. They wanted a place that was an Arab place where they could write their own story. And this is what they did. And by doing so, they left many contradictions and discrepancies and oddities.
Are you saying Allah was writing fibs into his own book?
Oh, excuse me, Lloyd.
Are you saying Allah was writing fibs into his own book? I mean,
no, actually,
I was reading the Quran yesterday.
Allah
it said there's a mountain that rings the earth that is 500 years tall. It is 2,000 years around. Now, me, I went on Google Earth and I had a look, and I couldn't find it. And I'm thinking the CIA must have hidden this mountain under a pile of sand. This is why, unless the mountain is under the sea, or it is so high, we just can't see it.
Maybe, but I won't put all the blame on Allah. Much more on the makers, the writers of the Islamic narrative. The narrative is full of contradiction, and actually, if you read the Quran without the narrative lens, without the Islamic lens, you see that the Quran is all about Jerusalem and not Mecca. This is what we discussed in our video series. But they left behind a major contradiction that we did not completely discuss in our video series, and this will be the topic of our discussion tonight.
I'm just curious, sorry to interrupt, because I hope I don't do so too much on these streams, but I'm just curious, what do you guys think of the claims that the Quran makes hello, Paul. What do you think of claims like the Quran makes? Besides Mecca now being fabricated to some degree, but a large degree, of a mountain circling the earth that's 500 years tall and 2,000 years around. How do Muslims explain these, shall we say, egregious geographical and, natural history errors in the Quran? And how, what do scholars do in regards to that when you ask them, where's this mountain?
I've never asked anyone that. It's a good question. One should It's maybe a question one should ask.
For my part, I would say that every time you ask a Muslim about something unreasonable or something that cannot be in the Quran, he doesn't reason actually. He keeps on repeating the narrative, or he tries to make up a story to explain it. But it's not about reasoning actually, because you see Islam force the Muslim into an unreasonable mindset. They they think with the categories of haram and halal, forbidden and permitted, and it is forbidden to have a forbidden thought. So it is forbidden to think that the Quran might be wrong. It is forbidden to think that the narrative might be wrong. So you cannot reason. You cannot reason if you don't explore both sides of the question.
Right. You know, interestingly,
Allahu alam, let's say.
Yeah, that's the answer.
no, something I've noticed, even though we are very much on the cutting edge here with what we do on this channel, or perhaps even on the bleeding edge, but I do notice that YouTube clearly messes with my statistics. Sometimes I think I'm getting tens of thousands of views, and YouTube will tell me I had 2,000 or 3,000 because. But anyway, what I'm finding is that Islamic apologetics is clearly backpedaling, constantly trying to find new defenses. And right now, they are very much trying to claim Jesus in a different way. They're trying to pose questions around this, like this one, that this guy's asking at the bottom here. I mean, he's not serious at all, but we definitely have them on the run. They are having to defend from too many angles now, and they can't.
Well, yeah, you see that there is a certain amount of communication. So I wrote an article, but that was in German. Odon was kind enough to translate it into French. Thank you, Odon. Merci. But on a partially false Islamic inscription mentioning Umar ibn al-Khattab. And but this is also what happens, used to have this in biblical archaeology with falsifications. People felt a need to counter the critical school with falsifications, but you see this that every time, and with the Winnett was a Canadian, I think he was an archaeologist, but he worked with the British Oil Company in the 40s and the 50s, and he discovered a lot of pre-Islamic inscriptions in Saudi Arabia. And he discovered really nothing relating to Islam. And then all of a sudden, when critical Islamic studies started appearing, all of a sudden, people find stuff that apparently relates to Islam, which is a little bit of a coincidence, when the Saudis start sponsoring these surveys.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had this once where when I published this inscription, there was a photo of it in Islamic Awareness that I showed had been photoshopped, and immediately afterwards, after the publication, they changed the photo.
Wow. So they're aware of us.
They're aware of it, yeah, and they're reacting to it. So
Yeah.
Actually, that's very telling, because the narrative has just been from the beginning invented, and it seems like enough people from within Islam, they know that that's the case, so they try to create things like this retrospectively. And this is one of the reasons I really like this topic about Mecca, because it not only shows that there is problems with Mecca, it shows that the narrative is a fabrication. If, for example, we couldn't find Bethlehem, for example, we didn't know where Bethlehem was, you would say, well, but it was a very tiny village in the middle of nowhere, and it doesn't really change the story of Jesus. He was born in Bethlehem, and we don't know where it is, for example. But in the case of Mecca, if they have made this huge, grandiose city with so many people and trade and stuff, and it's the foundations of everything. So by exposing that, hey, if whatever happened 1400 years ago, it had nothing to do with what we have been told, and look at the evidence by looking at the city, it reveals they have made that up. And things like what Professor Kirk has just said, that they would do things like this with inscriptions in the 21st century, it's quite telling that they have spent 1400 years creating a narrative, and they are still trying to do that, but we are not having it anymore. And hi, Paul, good to see you.
Hi, Paul. Yes. What I would say there.
Sorry, I was a little bit late joining you guys.
An Englishman is never late. We're not French. But anyway, your excuse. But what I would just say, I wouldn't use the term, invented. I would say it. If you look at the Arabic text, it was developed. What I mean is, it's like, when a snowball, speaking Canadian, you start rolling it down a hill, it takes on speed and gets bigger. So I think it was the narrative was and is continually being added to, because, for example, when you read what's clearly the oldest part of the Sirat, the Maghazi literature, the campaigns of Muhammad attributed to Muhammad, which tend to be rather vague. And then, when you read Waqidi, he fills in the details left by the Sirat and the Nas and the later authors. So where the Sirat tends to be vague about, where the battle is and what have you, Waqidi knows all the details. And then even later you get the books of all the participants, that mention all the participants. So there is a logical development here, that it's clearly there's been questions being asked, and the authors are writing to meet a demand for more information. But of course, the additional information is unsourced and it becomes a legend. What I mean, just to make it clear, JC, I don't think it was sort of invented in one go. It was, it developed over time. It's clearly.
My take on this is, first of all, that I don't think it started off as falsification.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. I think that the people who had the text and the people who began to create the narrative, and it seems to be quite a large number of people, the early collections of hadith we have, people like I've forgotten the gentleman's name,
Bukhari?
Malik,
Malik.
with the Muwatta, and Al-Bazak, is it? These people had dozens of people who they were citing from who didn't necessarily agree with each other, and sometimes people come in the same collection, and these people, it seems highly unlikely to me that the early hadith collectors created a fictitious world of people, and they shared them with one another so that each of them had the same people carrying on the same story. It seems very sometimes disagreeing with each other or saying things that the editor didn't themselves believe. It seems far more likely that somebody who wanted to just create a story would have just one or two golden chains of transmission and say, oh, this person told me the whole story, this is what the story is. And the fact that they have got all these stories, putting them together makes it sound like all these stories were swirling around there in a milieu of storytelling, really. And that's how you end up with this, with a character, Muhammad, who seems completely inconsistent. Past best, in one moment he's a peaceful, nothing, naught but a warner, is a kind of doesn't do any miracles. The next moment he's splitting the moon in half. The next moment he's leading an army and he's suddenly a strategic genius and he's working out his strategy and how he can defeat armies and this sort of thing. And most of all with his private life, when he's married to Khadija, who's 15 years older than him, family man, raises a family in a city where polygamy is completely commonplace and normal, and divorce, very freely available. And then after Khadija dies, suddenly he's got 19 other wives and concubines from various sources, and it's just impossible to imagine that this is one single person. It looks like somebody is just cobbling together all the stories and putting together almost a ridiculous montage of all the different stories. Would be my take.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I concur, because if you look at in the stories there, if you take away the intertextuality, and in some cases you can see what's happened. So, for example, you have a take on in the Hadith on the feeding of the 5,000 from the New Testament, which has been adapted to Arabic circumstances. So once you take away the intertextuality, you see these stories and they kind of centralized around a figure clearly. And what you said, so I remember a long time ago when I was doing my doctoral research and I was in Libya, and one time it was during Ramadan, and the blokes I was with, very good Tuaregs, they had this habit of reading the Hadith in the evening during Ramadan, and one of them would read a Hadith and then they would discuss what they think gave rise to these Hadith. And, they came up with these fantastic stories, I think this Hadith happened because this and this must have happened. And so you got these oral narratives accompanying the Hadiths, you see, and I think this is probably to a large extent what happened. But what you see, for example, without wanting to be partisan any which way, so if you look, for example, at the apocryphal Gospels, they usually fit in the lacunae left by the canonical Gospels.
Right.
So Jesus was born, and then he's presented at the temple, but what did Jesus do when he was in Egypt? And then you next hear about him when he's at the temple, and then you hear nothing from him before the marriage of Cana, and then sometimes in the Gospels you have this recurring phrase, and this and much more Jesus spake with his disciples, but exactly what? And then in the week after, the Holy Week after Palm Sunday, Jesus speaks with Judas, but it's never recounted what. And also with the disciples going to Emmaus, what they exactly spoke with Jesus is not recorded. So it's interesting that the apocryphal Gospels, they fill in always these lacunae left by the canonical Gospels. So in many ways, the apocryphal Gospels show that the canonical Gospels must have had an authority early on. But you see the opposite with the Islamic literature, that the sources become increasingly more detailed as time goes on.
Right. Yeah, we should go back to Odon since we're hijacking his time, and I have so many questions, but
let's go back to me. But I have an anecdote here that is of interest, but it's related to the topic of Mecca and Jerusalem. If you look at Tabari's tafsir about the trial of Abraham, when God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, Tabari relates that the son according to the tradition, the Islamic tradition, the son is Isaac, and he is to be sacrificed in Jerusalem. So it means that in early Islam, it was about Jerusalem, and it was much more connected to the biblical context. But At-Tabari also relates that there are other traditions, there is sort of competition between traditions. There is this other trend of traditions that say that the son is Ishmael and that he is to be sacrificed in Mecca. And in the end, we know that the Isaac and Jerusalem part of the story was completely dismissed. And nowadays, it's all about Ishmael and Mecca. And if you ask any Muslim celebrating the feast of the sacrifice, the Eid al-Adha, every Muslim knows it's about Ishmael. So you see how, and At-Tabari, he was writing in the 10th century. So you see, it took centuries for the narrative to become sort of complete. Even the Meccan narrative. The Meccan narrative was not complete at the time of At-Tabari.
No.
And you see this a lot with the trips that Abraham has to take to Mecca. So it starts off with Abraham just has to take Hagar to go between Safa and Marwa, and so he has to take her somewhere to build the house, and then that seems quite close at one stage, and then they have to extend it so that it becomes whatever it is, like 1,000 miles. So then they add in Burak to the flying horse to take Abraham down there, and then because that doesn't leave time for the sacrifice, because if the story of Safa and Marwa only really works with Hagar putting baby Ishmael underneath a rock or whatever, it only works if Ishmael is a helpless babe. But if it's a helpless babe, he can't be old enough to help Abraham build the house, raise the foundations of the house. So then he needs another trip. He has to keep coming back, and he keeps coming back again, and ends up with sort of like 5 different visits. And it's clear that there's it's not that somebody had the whole text and painstakingly created a story. I think that the surahs were being moved around individually, and maybe not even complete surahs, and people are making a story a little bit at a time. And then every time somebody comes across it, says, "Oh, what does this mean?" Somebody says, "Oh, I heard that so and so said this," and you're just getting this.
Or they might have had a more chronologically accurate story, realized the details were incriminating, and then decided to start stripping out the details.
Well, if you only have maybe a quarter of the surahs, and you try and make up a story that you think will explain that, and then somebody else comes along with a few more surahs, you've got to keep changing the story to try and make it make it rather like my other life as a lawyer. It's rather like a witness in the stand who's confronted with contradictory evidence, and they have to keep changing their story. And oh yes, I remember now.
Yeah, look.
Well, part of the problem is, of course,
please, just one moment, please, Dr. Kerr. We in Western culture assume that everyone thinks like us. However, you need to understand other cultures are not necessarily even trying to be honest. They don't necessarily even value honesty. They value winning. And honesty can just get in the way of that. So therefore, they will do what is necessary to save face. And if that means lying, cheating, and winning, getting one over, then they'll do that. So we must also attribute malice to some of what they do. Mm-hmm. Dr. Kerr, yes?
No, well, yes, but I would concur. But also, one also must understand that our notion of history is a little bit unique to the West. So there isn't necessarily a sense of chronological history in other cultures. And you see this, for example, in the Quran, where the biblical figures, there's nothing that goes out of the Quran. If you just read the Quran, you wouldn't know whether Moses lived before Abraham or Abraham before Muhammad. So all of the Quranic prophets, they're only listed quasi as witnesses. If you don't obey the commandments, Allah will punish you. So there is no chronological framework either, such as in, for example, in the Bible. So there's also different views. So this whole notion, and I think part of the dilemma is that now that Muslims, so if you look, for example, in Islam, part of the idea of reciting Quran recitation and Hadith recitation is to somehow transpose yourself into the time of Muhammad and his friends. So it's not, one of the problems that we have in the West also is that we tend to look at Islam through Christian glasses or Judeo-Christian glasses, and we assume that the Quran plays the same role as the Tanakh in Judaism or as the Christian Bible in Christianity. And it doesn't, because this is part of the misunderstanding. And I think it's only part of the dilemma is so that if you look in the traditional Islamic interpretation, they weren't really too interested in chronology and our linear way of thinking. And it's only now with Muslims in the West that they try to do this contortion dance to fit Islam into Western rational thought, which produces the dilemmas we're talking about. For example, so if you look, for example, at the manuscript transmission of the Sirah, you see peaks in Andalusia in the 12th century and in the early Ottoman Empire in the 15th, early 16th century, which kind of implies that people weren't really interested in the Sirah. And it was only really when Guillaume's translation came out that Muslims started taking an interest in the Sirah, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, Odon, shall we jump into your topic before we get started?
Just to interrupt, I just want to say to Odon's remarks about Tabari, if you read, for example, Surah As-Safat, so 99 on, the dilemma is, of course, the Quran never mentions which son is about to get sacrificed.
No, it's never. It's not clear in the Quran. It's never mentioned specifically.
It's never mentioned, just the son.
But you can deduct.
Or a boy. A boy is mentioned only. Khulam is mentioned.
I think it's in Surah Al-Safat, isn't it? Is it not 37?
Surah 37,
and it introduces them as the child of whom good tidings, and it starts off. There's a little excerpt with and Abraham received, or somebody gave Abraham good tidings of a knowing son. And I think, and that's the same phrase that is used consistently for Isaac. And Ishmael was never revealed. There were no good tidings for Ishmael.
No, but also because Isaac was the son of the promise, of course, and who was a good tiding. That was.
Yeah. Ustama knows that pretty well. He covers this in his Quran translation because, Pity Usama didn't make it today. He'd be very detailed on that topic. Yeah.
But I think in Surah Al-Safat is pretty clear that it's Isaac. I think
I think so.
You have to really want it to be Ishmael to put any doubt into it.
Yeah. Okay. Anyhow, let's do this presentation. What do you think? It's about
I think
Mecca.
so. We have so many questions.
Get on with it, Odon.
Yeah, let's do this.
So let me just share my screen.
Yeah, but I think we attribute other cultures too much good faith, which they not necessarily do.
Lovely presentation, Odon. Lovely presentation, Odon.
Finally, it got here. It got here.
Lovely. And I just have to do some settings. Okay. So it's taken from this presentation that I did in London at the NAPC, where I presented some evidence, some hard evidence for Islam's actual early history. Let me just need to do a little bit of setting. Yeah, okay. So I won't do the presentation. I will jump to the Mecca's climate, environment, and hydrology part, which is this one. This one. Let's start by saying that the climate and environment in Mecca is evidence for the falseness of the Islamic narrative. The narrative says that there was a sort of prosperous city there, thriving on commercial, thriving on trade, and this city would have hosted something like maybe 1,000 or several thousand inhabitants. But the climate is very, very harsh. It's the same today as it was in the 7th century and before. Actually, it hasn't changed since thousands of years. I've checked this with a study of a specialist.
Since 5,000 BC, it hasn't changed much. No.
Yeah, that's the thing. I've got a study of the climate in Mecca for the 20,000 last years, and we can be confident that it's the same climate today than it was during the antiquity and during early Islam. And it's a very, very harsh climate. Nothing grows, as you can see on this very early picture of Mecca in 1899, one of the earliest pictures, photographs.
Snookergonia.
Yeah. So it's a very harsh desert climate with very few rainfall per year, 130 millimeters. And not only is there very few rainfall, but there is a considerable variability. It can happen that it doesn't rain during a whole year, or maybe more. And if you look at the recent rainfall, for example, in 1990, 2003, 2013, there has been less than 25 millimeters of rain. And this is very problematic because the water resource in Mecca is entirely dependent on rainfall. There is, of course, no permanent stream or river, no access to the sea. The sea is something like 80 kilometers from Mecca. And there is no access to fossil water underground. So the only water you get in Mecca comes from the rainfall. The rain falls in Mecca. It is absorbed a bit in the terrain, but the terrain is very rocky, contrary to Yathrib, for example. Yathrib is also entirely dependent on rainfall, for its water resources. But in Yathrib, there is a lot of alluvial soil, sandy soil, that retain water. And because of this, you can have many wells in Yathrib with lots of water. And this is the completely different situation in Mecca. The terrain is rocky. The rain is not very well absorbed. There are not many wells in Mecca. If you look in the tradition, of course, there is the Zamzam well that still exists today. But the tradition is doesn't talk a lot about the other wells. I've looked in all the hadiths, and I've looked into the Akhbar Mecca book that was written in the 9th century. It's a traditional view of Mecca. And it mentions between 10 and 12 wells, including Zamzam. And from this evaluation, you can try to guess or to estimate the yield, the total yield of the wells. If you look at Zamzam, for example, the water is 30 meters under the surface. You have to draw the water by hand. There is no mention of a mechanical device such as a Persian wheel or a sakia, with a horse or a donkey activating it. So the yield is it's only about what one person can do with his own two hands, with a rope and a bucket or a skin. And if you do the calculation, if you have one person working on the well all day, it amounts to a yield of 1 to 2 cubic meters for the well at maximum. So for 10 to 12 wells, you have a total of 10 to 20 cubic meters of water per day, with this high risk of well depression during the prolonged periods of low rainfall. So this is a very a key figure. We have this resource in Mecca, 10 to 20 cubic meters per day on average. And so the question is, what can you do with this quantity of water?
Actually, sorry, can I ask something before we move on?
Yeah, of course.
So, yes, do you have an idea or a hypothesis as to when the well may have been actually dug up? I've checked; it's about 30 meters deep, and it is a hand dug well. So, do you think someone, perhaps even in ancient times before Islam, just happened to be there and happened to have found water, or do you think that Islam appears first, and then at one point they are digging up that well? Do you have any thoughts on that? What came first, Mecca or the well?
I think there was the wells, or some of them were dug before Islam, and I think it's one of the reasons that chose this site to build the Islamic Mecca. But the thing about the 30 meters depth of the Zamzam well, it has to do also with its history. They kept digging deeper and deeper and deeper, so maybe it wasn't that deep in the 7th century. Still, it doesn't change the calculation for the yield. But it's a very good question. You see, what's really puzzling is that it should be a vital topic for the history of Mecca. But it's not that it doesn't seem that important in the tradition. Yes, Robert, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to add, though, that even in the Islamic tradition, to answer also JC's, not to answer, but to comment on JC's question, that the Zamzam was lost. That's Azraqi again, the Akhbar Makkah. That and Abd al-Muttalib was told apparently in a dream about the Zamzam. But what is interesting is that in other versions of the story, he's told to dig up something called either Taiba, Tibba, Bara, al-Masnuna, or Khabiyat Ashaykh. So even in the Islamic tradition, it's not quite unanimous. So it's clear that the story, whether it's originally Zamzam or not, is not even clear from the Islamic tradition. And in the dream, it says, dig out the Zamzam, he's told, and he asks, what is the Zamzam? It never dries up and never doesn't provide water, which is a bit weird if it was lost and there's hardly any water in Mecca. And then when he digs it out, he finds various things when he's digging it out. So he, in the tales it's told of, he finds a suit of armor, certain swords, 2 golden gazelles, and etc., etc. So when you read the story, it's not clear whether the point is to dig a well or to dig out objects. It's not clear what is meant, because they also talk about the treasure house, and so it's a bit unclear what's happening, and you get the impression that this story is rather similar to what you find in 2 Maccabees 2:4-8, and I'll shut up there.
Yeah, that's the thing with the Islamic tradition. It's not. It's never clear. If you look at the Al-Azraqi's book, Akhbar Mecca, he mentions many wells. But if you look at the whole of the tradition, and the work has been done by this guy, it's a book by a Muslim named Binimad al-Atiki. I think he's from Kuwait, and he did a recension. He did a sort of the book is called Makkah at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and Sheikh Yasir Kadi has written about it to the best of my knowledge. Such a detailed and amazing work has never been written before in any language. So it's a sort of collection of every tradition, everything about Mecca in the Islamic narrative, in order to get maps such as this one. This is a map. You don't see it, but very well. But he's got a YouTube channel and a website, binimap.com, and you can see the many maps he did of the Mecca of the Islamic narrative. So it's a city with at least, I've counted them, 800 houses. So at least 2,000 or 3,000 people living there. He mentions 13 wells, but some of the wells he mentions were not active during Muhammad's time. Some are not mentioned by Al-Azraqi, and Al-Azraqi also mentions wells that are not mentioned in this book. So that's the thing with Islamic narrative. You can never be sure. This is why I put forth the hypothesis that there were about 10 to 12 wells in Mecca, according to this tradition. I've got another interesting data from the British Naval Service of Intelligence. They did a map of Mecca in 1946, And in this map, there are only 4 wells in Mecca, including the Zamzam well. So it can mean that it doesn't mean that there weren't 12 or 10 wells in the 7th century. It can mean that some of the wells were forgotten, or they didn't need them anymore, since aqueducts were built in the 9th century. But I will stand with this hypothesis of about 10 wells in Mecca yielding 10 to 20 cubic meters of water per day. And the question is then, what can we do? What can we have with such an amount of water? I've looked into what the specialist says about the average daily drinking need in a desertic environment. And so these are minimal hypotheses. 1 person drinks 2 liters per day. It would need more in a desertic environment.
I was gonna say, I've lived out there, and I've been not in Mecca, but I've been around it. I've been in Taif a couple of times. I've been all over. You're gonna need more than 2 liters a day if you're out there.
Yeah,
I agree.
You might need 2 liters an hour.
I've been in that area too, and unless you include beer, but
Yeah, but I mean, seriously, if you're out there doing some serious work, you might need 2 liters an hour.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but the people that live there and that are accustomed to the climate, they might survive with only 2 liters per day.
Sure.
But like I said, this is a very minimal hypothesis. The same for the sheep and goats, 5 liters per day. Should the climate be very, very hot, they would need a bit more, especially because the vegetation, the bushes and the herbs they eat would get very dry should it be very hot. A horse drinks at least 30 liters a day. The tradition tells about horses in Mecca, which is completely ludicrous. There are no horses in the desert because a horse needs 30 liters a day. But still, let's see if there is water enough for horses. And a camel drinks on average 40 liters a day. There is this idea that camels don't drink because they can survive without drinking for a week or 10 days, sometimes more. But on average, they do need water, and they do need 40 liters per day. So with these parameters in mind, I've done a calculation. What could the yield of 10 to 20 cubic meters per day, what could it sustain? You have also to take into account that the people would have this would live on the cattle. The cattle will provide milk and flesh, and this is how they would survive. And they could, on the occasion, they could sell an animal or two to get provisions. And it's the same type of calculation. If you take a population of 500 people, they would need at least 2,000 sheep and goats and 200 camels to survive. I've added 10 horses, but it's just for it's just a sort of concordism with the Islamic narrative. And if you look at this distribution, 500 people raising 2,000 sheep and goats and 200 camels, it amounts to a daily consumption of 19,300 liters per day, so around 20 cubic meters. This is the maximum that you could get out of the Mecca's wells. This is the absolute maximum. it's a very high output assumption because, like I said, and like we said, the people and the animals might need more water. And besides, should there be a bad year for rain, the well will deplete or will go. There won't be water enough for such a community. But
Paul wants to ask how much water do cats need?
Oh, very few. And but it depends on the on the kind of animal they can feed on.
Yes, my apologies for my for Mimi. I'm not sitting in my normal room today. My dear wife is using my study to for a work conference call, so I've been relegated to the dining room, and this is where Mimi likes to come and sit in front of me. So she's very interested in all this.
Yeah.
Don't forget, Odin, that they need a Khalida as well. When they have the festivals and they have to sacrifice the cattle, they've got to have lots of cattle there in order that everyone has to sacrifice. But they also have to festoon themselves with garlands, and imagine that must be quite tricky in somewhere like Mecca. The standard of garland might not be quite what we're used to in more fertile environments.
Yeah, this makes me think that I forgot to say something. With this amount of water, 10 to 20 cubic meters per day maximum, you cannot have any type of irrigation for cultures. Agriculture is not possible with such a low quantity of water. This is why I put forth the hypothesis that the population was living on its cattle only, because it cannot be they won't be able to grow anything in Mecca. So it's only about yeah, excuse me, Robert.
Yeah, no, just to interrupt, Paul raises a good point, because if you look again at our friend Azraqi, he says that the daily sacrifice for Hubal was 100 camels, 100 cow.
Yeah.
So
again, it's pure fantasy. It cannot take place in Mecca. It cannot take place in Mecca. You cannot have cows in Mecca. Now, maybe you could imagine that there would have been cows and many camels in Taif. But Taif is three days walk from Mecca. So you would have to bring all the animals for the sacrifice from Taif.
Taif had a dam, yeah.
And some of them might die during the walk because of the lack of water. And upon arrival, they will be they have to be sacrificed immediately because there is no water for them in Mecca. So I think it's pure fantasy, this idea of hundreds of camels being sacrificed, and the same with the thousand camels caravans coming out of Mecca. It's completely impossible with the water resources in Mecca. And the thing
may I
also,
ask?
yeah,
Sorry.
go on, JC.
So just quickly, so this is based on obviously an upper estimation, and it will be only people and animals drinking, right? So this doesn't account for any water that people will need for cooking, for cleaning, for bathing, for cleaning, for washing themselves, for voodoo later with Islam. So it would be just if all that they do is they get the water out of the well and they drink it, and there is no more usage anywhere in the village. This would be the maximum number, right?
Exactly. That's the maximum number you can come up with, 500 people. So at this point, it's already a blatant contradiction.
Yeah. Odon,
With
can I
Islamic
pause
narrative. But it gets even worse.
Odon, can we
Which
just pause there for one moment? Mick M has here, the Zamzam well supplies at least 950,000 liters of water daily, and this can increase to over 1.6 million liters during Hajj and Ramadan. Now, true and well, we'll leave it at that without going into too much detail. Well, we will. However, this is what Google is saying right now, but Google is working on the assumption, and it seems that this narrative that we see here is working on the assumption that this is water that is pure as the driven snow coming straight from the Swiss Alps down through rocks that have aged for 1 million years, crystallizing the water, adding light bubbles, and it comes up through the well in little bottles made of crystal glass, which is, I'm sorry, but that's a fake narrative, because decades ago, centuries ago, this well struggled because the rainfall is not consistent, the soil is not consistent, and so you would have periods with no rain, periods with small rain, and the water would become extremely salty, the water would become dirty, the water would become unavailable, dry up completely. And even if there's an aquifer issue, even if there was flooding, that flooding brings in a lot of silt, a lot of dirt, a lot of other things that pollute the water. It takes weeks for that to clear out, then the water's got to filter back into the well. And what I noticed was, I decided to look at Gemini, I had a little chat with Gemini, and I told it that story sounds very convenient because it gave me a beautiful story about this perfect water supply. And I said, well, yeah, we just forgot that there was massive engineering done in the 1970s. Pipes were laid, the water is cleaned, the dams were built, dams feed water into the aquifer, plus they send water from Jeddah.
Shuaib 5, yeah.
Yeah, and also I didn't build it. I designed the security system that secures the entrance to that particular desalination plant in Saudi Arabia. My company was paid to design that, and I was the engineer that designed that security system.
Okay.
So it seems like Gemini conveniently forgot a few things until I reminded it of a few facts. So the standard narrative that the Saudis are putting out, or Wikipedia or whatever, is, let's just say it lacks a few critical details. I'll leave it at that. Hold on.
Yeah. Now, but the point needs to be addressed. You said very very good things, Lloyd. I could add that my calculation is based on the fact that the water is drawn by hand, and nowadays water is pumped with electric pumps that yield so much more than what a person can do with his bare hands, a rope, and a bucket. And there is something else also. Nowadays, and it's been nowadays there is a huge supply of water from the Red Sea, from the desalination plants, from all the reservoirs that has been built by the Saudis, which means that the water in available in the soil is completely taken for the Zamzam needs. You see, during the 7th century, should there have been those 10 to 12 wells, they were all sort of connected. If you drew water from the Zamzam well, this is water that you could not draw from another well because they were sort of connected. Imagine that every other well is inactive, then you could have, with an electric pump, a much better yield in the Zamzam well. So it sort of answers all the objections that needs to be addressed. There is also something else. The Saudis, with all their works and the developments, they have expanded the capabilities of the Zamzam well by injecting water from the desalination plants into the well, And this is one of the reasons why the yield is that massive today. And it gives, it sort of complements the idea that many Muslims have, that Zamzam is a magical well, that because it has been given by God to Hagar, it's magical. Its supply is limitless, would be limitless.
My problem is, if you look at the Islamic narrative, right, Hagar gets there with the boy, and she gets dumped under a tree for shade with 7 ajwa dates, and she leaves him sitting against a rock or whatever, depending on the story you read, the version that you read, and he's busy dying, and she's crying, and she's running up Safa, and she's running up Marwa looking for anyone to help. Now here she is in the oldest, most established city in the world, with the world's oldest temple, and she looks around and all she sees is a sea of sand in the world's oldest, most established city with the world's oldest, most established temple.
It wasn't a city yet,
right? And yes, but it's the oldest temple on earth. It's the first temple ever built. Adam built it. There's a whole city. There's people, and she's running, and she sees nothing but sand. And then she comes down. She's crying, and then an angel comes, and an angel digs a hole with his foot. No. The boy hits his heel on the ground, and it makes it. No. A bird comes along and digs its claw. No. An angel comes along and uses the tip of its wing and scratches a hole, and the water gushes out. Now, the well has always been there, except the well was created by an angel or a bird or a different angel using his wing or his foot or something. And then she was running around in a city where there was nobody, but it's the oldest city and it's always been there. And the story makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah,
as I mentioned last week, then the tribe of Keturah shows up, which is, of course, Abraham's second wife.
But all these stories somewhat derived from the Bible. In the Bible, you find previous stories of Hagar finding wells.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where they took their inspiration.
Yeah.
But let's go back to this resource dilemma. Like I told you, with a yield of 10 to 20 cubic meters per day, we could have a maximum population of 500 people living in Mecca on the Meccan wells. But there is an issue here. Such a population would require, like I wrote here, 200 camels, and at least 200 camels, and at least 2,000 sheep and goats. It would be better to have 500 or 1,000 more sheep, but the water in Mecca won't be sufficient enough. But the thing is, these animals need to eat. They need pasture land. And if you look at what the specialists in pastoral economies have established, in such an environment, a desertic environment, a sheep or a goat would need 65 hectares per year of grazing land. And a camel will require 4 times this surface, so 260 hectares per animal per year of grazing land, of pasture land. And if you do the calculation, you could have a low estimate of 500 square kilometers and a high estimate of 1,500 and maybe more, even more, 2,000 square kilometers, 3,000 square kilometers required. Wow. And there is no such land in the immediate vicinity of Mecca.
Yeah.
I just
Sorry, just a related aside, but Google apparently claims, when you ask it, that 1,000 years ago, Zamzam had so much water it could supply a city of 80 to 200,000 people. Now,
1,000 years ago,
I checked. Paris and London had 25 and 30,000 people populations back then. and those are well-established, well-attested cities. I have no, and they're sitting on water. I don't know how. So clearly, Google is willing to either lie or it's being fed a lot of lies. Scary stuff.
Of course. But 1,000 years ago in Mecca, there was a whole system of canals and aqueducts bringing water, fresh water, from 60 to 80 kilometers away. And there was a huge supply of water at the time, but not in the Zamzam well. It was thanks to this system, the Ain Zubaydah, the source of Zubaydah. Zubaydah was allegedly a wife of Harun al-Rashid, the Abbasid Caliph, and she had this system of aqueducts and canals built in order not to have pilgrims dying of thirst in Mecca. I think it's more of a clue of the time when the Abbasids decided that Mecca was to be the place of Islam's origin and the place of the Hajj. But if we go back to the resources, the resource dilemma, you see that the cattle will require a huge surface of pasture land. There is no such surface around Mecca. And so you would have to take your cattle in a nomadic parcours around Mecca, but it would stretch very, very far from Mecca. You would have to follow, for example, the wadis and to look for the best land to graze your cattle. And so with such a surface that would be required, you see here, I've pictured it in the form of circles centered around Mecca. But actually, it couldn't have such a shape. You would see a sort of maze of routes around Mecca, stretching very, very far, maybe hundreds of kilometers from Mecca. It would mean that you couldn't have a sort of sedentary community in Mecca, because you would need to take the cattle very far from Mecca. So you would lead a nomadic life, a pastoral nomadic life, and so you won't live in Mecca. So you see, even with the 10 to 20 cubic meters of water in Mecca, you cannot lead a sedentary life in Mecca. You can only imagine that Mecca could have been a sort of temporary site for nomadic pastors, but not a sedentary city. And this is
one also has to remember that Mecca is in the bottom of a valley, so
there are other factors. Mm-hmm. So this would be my conclusion. If you exclude the agricultural requirements, the water available at Mecca could theoretically have supported at most a community of around 500 people operating within a desert pastoral economy, disregarding the irregularity of rainfall, which directly affects water availability. Such a community would have depended on substantial livestock population for its survival. So at least 2,000 sheep and goats and 200 camels. But, however, this livestock would itself have required vast grazing areas, potentially exceeding 1,500 square kilometers, necessitating an extensive and mobile pastoral system spread across a very large territory, following pastoral routes far beyond the immediate surroundings of Mecca, and relying on additional water sources from elsewhere, assuming such sources existed. So in other words, it would have required a nomadic way of life. So the hypothesis of a sizable sedentary community concentrated in Mecca, sustained by a stationary livestock population grazing around the town and relying on its local water resources, therefore appears highly implausible. So it's a polite language. Actually, it's completely impossible. completely impossible. So only a nomadic pastoral economy could have enabled a significant population to survive under such climatic conditions. That is, to survive primarily not in Mecca itself, but outside it and far beyond its immediate environs. So this is my take on this water question in Mecca. And I think it's very interesting, because at first one would tend to consider that water is the limiting parameter in Mecca. But the actual limiting parameter is the availability of grazing lands. And the conclusion is it's not very good for the Islamic narrative. Mecca could not have existed as it is described. It could have only be a temporary site for a nomadic pastoral population.
The problem is the Quran speaks of, like you said, these guys were fishermen, there were date palms, they were farming, there were animals.
Exactly.
And human drinking water is a drop in the bucket compared to what is necessary for farming and livestock.
Yeah.
I mean, and camels and horses, because, I mean, farming consumes thousands of times.
Never mind fishing.
Yeah, there are many things to consider. We talked about the farmers and the fishermen during our video series on the Jerusalem thesis. And you see all these different arguments, they converge and they establish that Mecca did not exist. So since it did not exist, it must have been created. And to create such a city, a city where everything has to be brought from the outside, including water, you have to have a very powerful state ordering such a construction. So it also tells us that it could not have happened in the early days of Islam, because the caliphate was not powerful enough to do such a big work. And besides, the tradition tells us that it happens, the construction of the aqueducts and so on happened at the beginning of the 9th century. So we have clues about the time period when Mecca was created. So I think it's also an interesting take on the Mecca question, because we don't see it anywhere. Patricia Krohn told a bit about the harsh conditions in Mecca, but she did not do all these calculations. Historians, mostly, they work with sources, archaeology. They don't work with agronomy experts or pastoral economy experts. And so it's interesting to look at this question from this angle and to see that it converged with what the historian says also about Mecca being an impossible city.
Well, what Cronus said, and what she also added, give her credit when she wrote too, but she pointed out if Mecca was such a rich city, what were they doing to earn their living? Never mind, were they able to earn it based on water? So what could they have conceivably produced that would have, that you could only make there, that was worth exporting large distances, with his caravans to Syria and what have you?
Yeah.
What were they producing then? That's a good question. What are they making there? Fish, maybe?
Fish, well, no, her only conclusion, but it was more, I believe, out of desperation, was she proposed that leather, but that's a bit dubious.
You need animals for that.
You need large livestock. But what I would
And of course, there are plenty of other places that would be much more suited for producing leather. So it's ridiculous to my mind that for example, the Byzantine Empire is going to have people, camel trains, caravans traveling across the desert for a month or whatever to get a few scraggy hides of leather, when they could have leather, unlimited leather in the Fertile Crescent and around the around,
of course,
but to be fair to
Byzantine,
Patricia
they got Europe. You got to have no end of leather in Europe.
Yeah, but to be fair to Patricia Krohn's article about the leather trade, it's a sort of an abstract work. She wrote herself in an article that she assumes that Mecca is a big city that exists, that there are no problems with water and so on. And her conclusion is that a leather trade could have been possible during the war between Persia and Byzantium. Because of the condition of the war, the Romans would have bought the leather at a much higher price. But that doesn't say that Mecca could have lived on such a trade before the war.
Exactly, yeah.
So in the end, Patricia Krohn's conclusion, based on her book Meccan Trade and on her article, is that trade from Mecca was impossible.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
I'm going to ask you, Odon. I think another. I think I'm right that Patricia Krohn, perhaps not there, maybe it was in Hagerism, postulated that there was possibly a Mecca that fulfilled some of the requirements, but it wasn't the Mecca in the Hijaz. So there was an actual shrine that was somewhere in the north, somewhere in Syria or Jordan, or what we now call Syria or Jordan, more fertile land. I think she thought that there was a place there, and that might have been called Mecca by the early Muslims. That would be, I suppose, what she would say. So I wonder what do you think of that, Odon? Is there a possibility that there was a Mecca that wasn't in the Hijaz at all?
It might have been, because we have sources documenting the existence of shrines, places of devotion to Abraham that were frequented by Arabs. So in northern Arabia, Arabia Petrae, up to the north of Syria, we have several places. There is an Abu Qubais in Syria, near Homs, and there was an Abraham shrine there. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting because you know the name Abu Qubais. It has been given to one of the hills of Mecca, a bit like Safa and Marwa in Jerusalem were used to give names to boulders in Mecca. There is another mention of an Arab Abrahamic shrine near Hebron. In I don't know the English name. It's in Terebentium. Mm-hmm. Robert, you might know the English name.
Yeah,
not offhand.
No, the Terebinth of Marmar. That's why I pronounce it. Yes,
Terebinth.
And I think that was promoted by Tom Holland, wasn't it? Tom Holland says that in his view, the original shrine was in the Terebinth of Marmar. So.
But it doesn't say that. Yeah, the existence of such shrines is very interesting, but it doesn't say that there were the equivalent of Mecca in the Islamic narrative. That there were the places of origins for Islam. Because I don't think there is a unique place of origin for Islam. Islam is far too complex, with many different influences. It hasn't got It doesn't have a unique place of origins. There are many different places like Jerusalem, Damascus, Baghdad, that were far much influential on the making of Islam than Abu Qubais or Terebin's.
But is it possible, Odon? I agree with that. But is it possible that there is a halfway position that there was somewhere that wasn't the place that was being written about in the Quran, and isn't the Mecca of the traditional narrative, but was the location, the setting for the narrative, and that setting, there's a hypothetical place, or maybe a real place, but when people told the story of Muhammad, they were thinking that he was in a city, and then at some later stage, that location then moved down to the Hijaz. Is it possible that there was a place within the imagination of the people writing the narrative? Oh, that's where Muhammad used to live. That's the place he was fighting over. I think Crone refers to a fantasy, a messianic fantasy.
Before we go further, JC wanted to add something. And also, the sand in Mecca, the soil, is not sand you can grow things on.
No, it's not sand, actually. It's a rocky terrain.
Yeah, it's the wrong. You can't grow stuff on that. But JC, what do you want to tell us here with this?
Yes, sorry, my computer had very rudely decided that it wanted to disconnect just as I wanted to actually show this. So this is just from the account of Ludovico di Barthema, so early 16th century, and just a witness account of a guy actually pretending to be a Muslim and going all the way to Mecca and traveling the world. So when he's describing what happens in Mecca, again, early 16th century, he actually first describes the water from that well, and it's the Zamzam well, because that's when they're doing the thing, as brackish, which either A, I mean, he could be completely wrong because it's just one guy giving his witness account. It could be that the water was actually good for drinking and he just got it wrong. Could be what Lloyd said before. Maybe the aquifer during particular periods of time actually got contaminated, and sometimes you can drink it, but sometimes you can't. So a number of things like this. And then immediately after, apart from saying that the water from that well was brackish, is he starts describing how they do the basically the ablution. And what happens is that people go in there and he always gets, by the way, all the Arabic wrong, but they draw water. So there will be people there drawing water all the time, and they throw 3 buckets full over each person. Which, of course, again, 16th century, at that point, they already have a lot of water because of the aqueducts, so they can use more. But it doesn't make a lot of sense that in a place where water would be so scarce, then Muhammad, or the guy who actually starts this tradition, or any tradition, would say that you have to actually use extra water to do things. Muslims will say, but you can do ablution with very, very little water. But what we see in the traditions is that, no, they actually bathe themselves. So imagine if you're creating a religion, you go to the place where you have absolutely no water, and then you ask people to use a lot of extra water. It doesn't make sense. Not quite.
Yeah, this is why he also recommended to use sand and rocks for basic hygiene.
An odd number of stones.
Yeah.
3 or 5, I think, are the only possible. I don't think 1 would work, and I don't think we could manage with 7. I think I have to be 3 or 5.
Yeah. No, there's another interesting point. So if you stay in Surat As-Safat in 138 to 139, Wabiya Laili, Afallah, etc., in the 137, I mean, and indeed you surely passed by them in the morning and at night, with reference, of course, to Sodom and Gomorrah, which is usually attributed to Lot's cave, which is at Zoar, which is modern Safi near the Dead Sea. So if you pass by Lot's cave in the morning and night, you're not near Mecca.
Yeah.
That's, I think, a point too. So, but I would concur with Odon, in as far as I don't think there's a particular site being referred to. So you've got some references to Makkah in pre-Islamic poetry, but that's a different question. But the Bi-Batni Makati, of course, that is a problem in the Quran. But what I mean is it's clear that the Mecca of Islamic tradition is fictional. And, this large city with a rich city, caravan city, which, and I assume you've discussed the problems with the caravans because it's not on a caravan route and what have you. That's that is all valid, but there remain then two problems. So I wouldn't say that it's clearly not a city. At the most what you would call in Canada a truck stop, or a little village in the middle of nowhere, a little settlement with a couple of people. Who knows? At the most. But the question is, why of all places was it chosen there?
Yeah.
And I think so. What is interesting is that you have the Kaaba, which you can take several different ways. If I can just share a 1 second, and I can just share a screen quickly. Where are we here? I would say partager l'écran et voilà. Okay. You have this interesting reference in Epiphanios Panarion, his little pharmacy of heresies. And there he's talking about, I think it's a group in Asia Minor who reject the canonicity of St. John's Gospel. And then he delves into when the true date of Christmas is, whether it's the 6th of January and or on Christmas. And then he points out that in Edessa, they celebrated the birth of Dusares on the 6th of January. And they went around town shouting, "A virgin has given birth to a child." So apparently also there must have been something in the water because virgins gave birth to children, I suppose, but I wasn't there. But there he talks about Dusares and his mothers, and he goes, "Auten arabisti kamu tutesin koren ait un parthenon kaiton," etc. If you look at the textual variants, you also have Kabu. And what is interesting here is he seems to have a valid source of Kamu, Kabu. For Arabic loanwords to Greek, that works. But the problem is the traditional etymology of Kaaba, being from kubos in Greek, doesn't work because it would need a kuf if it was borrowed from Greek. And where does the ein come from? And I would suggest here that if you look at Lane's dictionary, can you read that or not? I'll try to make it bigger. Is that getting better?
That's good.
Kuhub.
Kaaba. Okay, that's a cube. So for the Kaaba, but you also have Quba, virginity. Kaab, having swelling breasts, a buxom girl, etc. So what is Kaib? Well-developed, full and round, swelling bosom, having swelling breasts, buxom girls, etc. So we're not trying to be dirty old men here, but this thing with
But
yeah, but nonetheless, But the point is, what is meant here with the reference to Epiphanios and Panarion is that he says the mother was called Kubba or something, and she was a Parthenos, a virgin. And the idea is behind here, it's usually Kaaba means to swell, so it's usually used of swelling breasts of girls during puberty who apparently tend to be virgins, more or less, except in the case of Aisha, I suppose, but we'll leave that aside. The point is, this is a good thing. So we know from Arabic sources that there are numerous Kaaba in the Middle East. So, for example, at Najran, which is clearly a Christian church, and there's a hadith where Muhammad orders the Kaaba to be destroyed in the Yemen, and he sends out an expedition. So one could say, especially with the thing in with the reference to the Kaaba in Mecca, one could say it might be going off the map, but it could have been a pilgrimage church, one might say, i.e. not a, you look in the Middle East, even in cuneiform texts, they're always going on a pilgrimage somewhere. And I'm not saying it's like Lourdes nowadays or something that, which has become an institution. This became that maybe because I think there's one thing that one has to, so whenever it happened, but there is a certain logic behind it without all of the embellishment of Muhammad and what have you. And that is now what am I doing here? Oh, no, this is much too big now. Okay, yeah, this is just something else. Yeah, so if you take a picture, let's reduce this a bit. You have the Kaaba as it is now, which does look like a cube. But if you look at the below right, you see this half-round thing called Al-Hatim. And if you then look at the layout, so Khatim, according to Lane, that's a structure where in pre-Islamic times, they used to congregate and what have you. But if you look at this, then it points to the northwest. And if you want to do the experiment on your own, with the Khatim, it rather points to Jerusalem. And according to Islamic tradition, in the middle there, so we know from Islamic tradition that the Kaaba was rebuilt numerous times. So at one time it was built just before Muhammad became a prophet. And there was an old lady doing something with candles there. So if you take it as historical, it would imply it's a church. But then they're rebuilding it. And what's interesting is they apparently rebuild the Kaaba part, but they want to put a roof over the Khatim part again.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what you see in the Sirah, they want to show that Muhammad is an important person, but he has nothing to do with the heathen, the pagan cult in the Kaaba, because, he's waiting for his time to become a prophet. But anyway, the Sirah also wants to show that he's the main man in town. So they come to Muhammad and say, yeah, the Kaaba burned down a couple of weeks ago, and we managed to rebuild the Kaaba part, but this Al-Khatim part needs a roof. And he goes, yeah, well, what's the problem? He goes, yeah, but we're Arabs. We don't know how to do carpentry. And he goes, well, there just happens to be an Egyptian in town, a Copt. Mm-hmm. And of course, Egyptians are great builders. So they get the Egyptian. He comes, yeah, how can I help you, Muhammad? Yeah, well, my friends here, they need to make a wooden roof. Can you help them? He goes, yeah, of course. I'm Egyptian. I design wooden roofs all the time. And says the only problem is I need wood. And so for some reason, Muhammad knows that last week, the week before, there had been a shipwreck at Jeddah of a Greek ship. So they launch an expedition to get the wood from the Greek ship, and they come back. But what's interesting, you see here the reference to two Christian cultures, the Greeks and the Egyptians, because in this time the Egyptians and the Greeks are, of course, Christians. And you have this curious story in Arzaki, Akbar Makkah, that on his farewell pilgrimage, and that's an interesting part of the Islamic narrative, because Muhammad is never interested in doing anything at the Kaaba when he's in Mecca, and his only time he does anything resembling a pilgrimage is his farewell pilgrimage, which he, according to the Islamic tradition, does with 100,000 people in one variant. I can't remember where I read that, but anyway, nonetheless, but the point is, Muhammad goes into the Kaaba and he sees all kinds of images of angels, Abraham, and what have you. And he says all of this stuff has to go, except for one image. So his buddies, they go to the Zamzam well to fill buckets of water. Apparently, the Zamzam was much more flowing in those days, despite the valid comments of Odon. But they go and they fill their buckets, and they come back and they start washing away all the images. And in the meantime, Muhammad has his arms over the one image and he takes them away. And what is it? It is the Virgin with a child. So this is the 9th century. It's a curious thing, but it seems to be referring to something. The only thing I would suggest is that, so Kaaba, that could be, you could take it two ways with this etymology. So, and I just don't have a better one. And Cubus doesn't work. It's impossible. But the point being, you could either say that it was originally a pilgrimage site for Dusaras and his mother that became a church, or it was just the church Our Lady of something or other. But what's interesting, according to the Islamic narrative, right there where the, I'll make it a tad larger, where the 8.46 meters is, where's my cursor? Here, about here, is the Khidr Ismail. And on the outside of the Khatim is the Khidr Hajar, the grave of Hagar and the grave of Ismail. And we know the Kaaba was rebuilt several times according to the Islamic narrative. And also afterwards, in the 15th century by the Ottomans, and then after the events of 79 and more recently, etc., etc. So what is interesting is, if you look at the 8.46 meters, if they're more or less, according to tradition, Ismail is supposed to be buried and Hajar is supposed to be buried somewhere outside, well, that would be right where you would expect the altar. So if this were a pilgrimage church for Ismail and Hagar, I'm not saying it was a big city, but, because we know from the Bible, they got sent into the desert according to Genesis 21. I don't have it in English here, but it's somewhere near Beersheba. But you're moving into the desert in Christianity. So my only suggestion is, if this was originally a pilgrimage site, and if you look at pilgrimage in late antiquity, modern tourism is a secularized form of pilgrimage. But, you have different types of pilgrimages. You had the deluxe pilgrimages, and then you had the Lonely Planet. You had people that went and did the Exodus over again, what have you. I'm saying, a limited pilgrimage to an obscure church, because if you look at the logic that was going on here, all of the biblical figures basically got churches. Ismail and Hagar are not buried at Hebron with the rest of Abraham's family. They have to be buried somewhere. But it makes perfect sense if you. So my point here with this Sozomon was that they, in the 6th century, the Romans, when the Arabs were limitanae infederati under Justinian II, they changed the rules, and the Romans could only make treaties with Christian tribes. So these guys had to become pro forma Christian. According to Sozomon, one of the tactics to convince them to become Christian was they were the descendants of Ismail. And of course, this is something that's brought to light, especially by Josephus, who was not read by Jews, but by Christians, and especially by St. Jerome, that the Arabs are descendants of Ismail, and they were, well, basically what they said was, okay, you guys, if you become Christians, you know, you're the descendants of the firstborn of Abraham, and you can somehow get part of your inheritance back. So if you have a religion, you have the idea it's somehow related to Abraham, but you've got Tawhid, you know, strict monotheism, none of this polytheistic Trinitarianism and all of that stuff. Well, you can escape Jerusalem, where, you know, it's saturated. You can start somewhere basically afresh, and you've got the link to Abraham through the son which you claim to descend from. So, because the point is, you still have to explain why. I agree with Odon that the Quran doesn't describe any particular site, and Mecca, this Mecca, or this site which we now call Mecca, cannot have been the Mecca, you know, of Islamic tradition. It's utterly unsupportable, but one still has to explain where this tradition comes from, and it's hard to invent something ex nihilo. Ergo, my modest suggestion that one might consider it having been a pilgrimage church. Because what is interesting, that if you look where Abraham dies, and I'd mentioned this before, where is that?
There is a report somewhere of the Kaaba being built in alternating layers of rock and wood, which is the style of the Ethiopian churches. And Ethiopia had significant, through Aksum, had significant, shall we say, influence over that region for some time.
No, Ethiopia had significant influence, especially in the 6th century, over Yemen. But they were in the south in Yemen, granted, but they also provided. Remember Muhammad's first, the woman who birthed him? Yeah, she was Ethiopian. He is rumored to have only spoken 2 languages, the second one being Ethiopian. The guy who built the lectern that he used was Ethiopian. He listened to the guys recite the Bible in Ethiopian. And there's a whole bunch of these references. And these guys were supposedly soldiers that guarded the caravans, but there was also heavy influence in the region. At one point, they exercised a fair amount of economic and military and cultural influence over the region through the Empire of Aksum. So there's reason to think that he would have been hearing things or knowing things from the region. Good. Well, let's say I'm not a big fan of the historicity of Muhammad either, and all of these tales, as I mentioned in a previous show. We can do that one time if you want. But I don't think Muhammad is a historical figure. So
I don't think anyone here does. I mean, so.
Yeah, okay, good. So with these tales, my only suggestion is, and here I think that's from after Ismail's Nachkommen. Wait a second. Where does Abraham die here?
Beersheba?
Yeah, but somewhere he took a wife again. Yeah, so it must be from, this is Targum from Genesis 25. And it was after these things that Isaac and Ishmael contended, and Ishmael said, it is right that I should inherit what is the father's, as I'm his firstborn son. And Isaac said, it is right, as I'm the son of Sarah, his wife, and you are the son of Hagar, the handmaid of my mother, and that I was there when Abraham made the covenant, and I was circumcised, but you were circumcised, where were you? And what have you. So there is obviously in the Jewish tradition a contention going on who is the most rights. And I've mentioned that the rabbis had a difficult explanation. This is why Keturah becomes Hagar. But the point is, I would only suggest, with all respect to Odon's excellent deconstruction, in the tradition of good French philosophers like Derrida and Foucault of Mecca. Yeah, you're in the best French tradition, Odon, of the Islamic Mecca. One still has to explain why, of all the places in earth, was Mecca chosen.
Yep.
And the second question is, how did it gain acceptance? Ergo, because if you look here at the, as I said, where Ismail is supposed to be buried at the 8.46 mark, which is where you would expect an altar in a Christian church. It makes sense. You'd have to explain why it would gain acceptance, and it makes perfect sense if the Arabs, we know the Arabs had been convinced that they were the descendants of Ismail. And one of the interesting things about the Arabs, especially in Roman literature, or Greek and Roman literature, but especially, literature of the Roman period in the Middle East, let's say, which could be in Greek or Latin, that all of the accounts of the origins of the Arabs go through Jewish sources. So you don't find any indigenous accounts of where the Arabs came from in Greco-Roman sources. They're all biblically inspired, so they probably came through a Jewish source. Therefore, it's not an indigenous tradition among the Arabs that they descended from Ismail, and by the 6th, 7th century, they must have taken it from the Romans in Syria. And this would then, as I said, make sense if you're convinced that you're descended from Ismail, or from Abraham through Ismail and not through the upstart Isaac, that you then take the pilgrimage site. And as I said, Kubus doesn't work, and this thing with the Hatim points to Jerusalem.
I have a slight, I've been thinking along the same lines as Professor Kerr, but I've got a slightly different conclusion, if I could possibly share. The building with, I would call it an apse, the footprint of the building, which is a rectangle and a semicircle on one end, looks like the footprint of an apse, or like a.
It's the basic floor plan of a basilica. Basilicas in the Middle East could be small. In Europe, people tend to think basilicas are these huge structures, but no, they could in this time in the Middle East be rather small. And sorry, just to interrupt, Paul, before I go on, before you go on, I don't want to hog all the time, but one must also remember that in Christianity, you could be buried in churches, but Islam has this taboo, as in Judaism, with dead bodies, that, you bury them quick and you don't bury them in sacred structures. But the only people buried in anything Islamic, really, the only person is Ismail, and that just happens to be in the most holy site. But go on, sir.
Well, a building with an apse pointing towards Jerusalem, I would instinctively think not of a church, which traditionally point towards the east, but of a synagogue. And so I wondered if it was an old synagogue that was somebody somewhere had built, and originally it was a full three-dimensional apse, and then at some stage along all the many rebuildings, it became cubic, possibly to reflect the name Kaaba, to make the physical structure resemble the name that it had been given, but the outline of the apse remained on the ground. And there is this tradition about Al-Hajjaj wanted to rebuild it as it was, and it was at some stage Ibn Zubair incorporated it, and then Al-Hajjaj took it out.
Accordingly to the wishes of Muhammad, they discovered post factum.
And one piece of evidence, Dan Gibson in his Qibla tool, he attributes the Kaaba to pointing towards Petra, and he says, and I have no reason to doubt his technical expertise in this, that it actually points slightly closer to Petra than it does to Jerusalem. Although if you're 1,500 miles away and it's the 7th century, I'm not sure 1 degree here or there is going to bother me that much. But what's interesting is during the account of the night journey, it says that Muhammad was sleeping in the Hatim, or in the Hijr, what do you call it? The Hijr Ishmael. Muhammad was sleeping there. Well, it seems an odd sort of place for somebody to sleep, particularly if everyone around you hates you and you're in fear of your life. You're about to be, you have to flee for your life. But there's a reason. There are 2 reasons why Muhammad should be sleeping there. One is because of if the night journey story is there created to explain the night journey verse of 17:1. He has to go from the Masjid al-Haram to the Masjid al-Aqsa, which means he must start at the Masjid. So he can't start from his bed at the home, which might be 100 or 200 meters away. He's got to start at the Masjid al-Haram. So that's one reason why he might be rather strangely going to sleep in this little low semicircle. But the other reason is it seems to preempt his destination. It's a bit of a coincidence that he's sleeping there when he's woken up and taken on the trip to Jerusalem, if he's actually sleeping in an apse that is, or the outline of an apse that is actually pointing to Jerusalem. And that seems to me that's part of the symbolism of the story. Now, just to complete my thought on this, I don't say for one moment that Muhammad really did make a miraculous nocturnal trip to Jerusalem, but the only significance of this that I can see is that people back in the day knew full well that this semicircle pointed to Jerusalem, because you wouldn't have made up that story if you didn't already know that as a historical fact. And the only way you would really know that is if everybody in the local area knew, oh, that used to be a synagogue and it points to Jerusalem.
I would just mention you could have churches that pointed to Jerusalem. I just refer here to my notes here. Lunsberger, the Sacred Direction in Synagogue and Church, Hebrew Union College Annual, 28, 1957. Dinkler, das Apsis Mosaik von St. Apollinare in the Wissenschaftliche Abhandlungen der Arbeitsgemeinschaft für Forschung des Landes Nordrhein-Westfalen, 29, 1964. And Diebner, die Orientierung des Jerusalemer Tempels und die Sacred Direction der christlichen Kirchen, Zeitschrift des Deutschen Palästina-Vereins, 88, 1972. So it is possible, I would just say.
I just want to throw something random into the mix.
Thank you very much for that, Professor. I'd be very grateful if I could ask you afterwards to send me those references, because I found that okay. very, very interesting. I wasn't aware of that at all.
Yeah, just to throw something random into the mix here. This is written by David A. King, everyone's favorite scholar, I believe. And as Odon will testify. But this was written in 1982 in a magazine called The Sciences, and he speaks of the Kaaba, and he says aerial photographs reveals another alignment. The major axis of the Kaaba is aligned to the rising of Canopus, and the minor axis is several degrees off the direction of summer sunrise. It is precisely aligned towards the southernmost setting position of the moon at the winter. Oops, sorry about that. At the winter solstice over the hills to the southwest of Mecca. And this discovery was made by Gerald Hawkins, best known for his work on the alignments of Stonehenge. And about every 19 years, the crescent moon sets at the spots on the horizon visible on the southeast side. And this alignment is also found in many megalithic sites in Europe. I won't go too far, I'll leave it at that. But it seems there might be more to this little monument than, because some of the scholarship goes back, I've gone back decades, and there's a lot of little known research done that just, covers topics that we don't discuss today, I guess. Or very.
I concur.
May I ask, so we know in the maps of Ptolemy that Yathrib was mentioned, and in the Islamic narrative, they changed the name to Medina, most likely because the Quran keeps talking about the city, which is Jerusalem, and then they have to just make the city Yathrib in the real world to be changed to Medina, to now be in the Quran, possibly. Now, is it possible?
Just to interrupt you, Tracy, briefly, sorry, but also in cuneiform sources. So if you remember in the 6th century BC, Nabonidus moves his capital from Babylon to not Taif, what's his face? Timnah, or somewhere in the north of Saudi Arabia, which is excavated by the Germans about 20 years ago, I think. And they found a lot of interesting stuff. But in the cuneiform text already in the 6th century BC, we find Yathrib mentioned.
Yes, the one in Iraq in that section. So, but if we look at the map of Arabia and the map of Ptolemy, seeing as there is this city called Yathrib, and because of Islam, they changed the name to Medina, do you know if anybody has actually checked if maybe one of those other cities, the other cities that Ptolemy mentions, that maybe another of those cities was tiny, it was perhaps it had a church or a synagogue or something, but that got rebranded, renamed to Mecca, just like they did with Yathrib, changed it to Medina. There was another city, they changed it to Mecca, and that may have been the beginning of the whole myth. If the city was there, even if it was tiny, is it possible that one of the cities in Ptolemy's map is that? Do you know if anybody has done any work trying to match each city from the map to the cities that we know exist and see if there is one that sticks out because we never found and it could be the original Mecca?
Not to my knowledge, but my point, I would say that, of course, as you mentioned, Medina, it's just the city, which is probably Jerusalem, of course, and that it becomes Yathrib, I think, it's much later in the Islamic tradition, but there is no reason to presume that, so the question is, when did Yathrib get renamed Medina? But it's also what one has to remember, that also in modern Arabic, Medina, it always has an adjective usually attached to it. What's it called? Medina Nawara or something. Munawara.
Yeah, Munawara. I was about to say it. Yeah.
Yeah, Al Madina Al Munawara, or and then later, which is just the city of lights, which might get Odon upset, but
if I can,
copyright infringement.
I am very upset, but not for this. There's a point I want to make about what you said, Robert. I'm not upset at all. It's an interesting hypothesis what you put forth. But the thing about the Meccan site being an old pilgrimage site, we have nothing positive to establish it. The only thing we have is the Hajj and the tradition of a pilgrimage in the Islamic narrative. But we know that it relates to Jerusalem.
No,
Just
So,
mention that.
no. My point was merely that one has to explain where Mecca comes from. You know,
yeah, I agree with
Can
you.
I jump in
my
here?
point is, I'm not saying it's a regular pilgrimage.
And
Yeah.
just Lloyd, just before, lots of your hypothesis depends on the actual architecture of the Kaaba, but we don't know exactly whether this architecture was the one that was used for the first Kaaba, the Kaaba
No,
that
but
was built in.
but the point is, my only point would be that this Al-Khatim, this wall there,
Yeah,
um,
it's not an invention.
why keep it?
Yeah, why keep it? Yeah, I agree.
Why invent it if it has no purpose?
The wall has no practical purpose. There's no reason why
There's
anyone
no
would build a
reason.
wall there.
Talk about that. We can talk about that later because it doesn't fit this particular paradigm, but it does fit a different one. I just want to mention old map, Saraceni up north here. Okay, Saracen, this is up north. You've got Sabei down here where Mecca should be, which is interesting, right? But then moving on, you've got.
I would point out, just to interrupt, I wrote about this in my Die Blaue Blumen von Mecca. So I just read a review of Odon's book where, which is still to be published, but where Remy Brague said in French. Unfortunately, my article was written in German, but I had to laugh. But anyway, I discussed, so this idea that Mecca could be Makoroba comes from Gibbon, his Rise and Fall.
This comes from 60. This idea first comes from, let me just get into that. So Bochart is the first person to make this connection, and he did so, I think, in 1647. So that assertion that Ptolemy was referring to Mecca was not made by Ptolemy. It's made by Bochart in his book in the 1600s. Right now, so this is Sacred Geography, 1646. Now, there's a lot of reasons why it can't be, but also just briefly then, when you take Makoraba, the Mukarabas, right, from Yemen, which is a term from the Yemenis, it actually maps onto Al-Mahabisha in Yemen. So when Ptolemy's coordinate system was remapped onto modern coordinate systems, when you use the old ones, you can see that these cities are all in the ocean. Everything is completely messed up. It doesn't map
just to interrupt for the listener, the problem with Ptolemy's map, he's pretty accurate in the Mediterranean region where people know where things are, but they didn't have they only had latitude and not longitude in Ptolemy's time. So the further he moves away, so it gets really weird when you look at where he puts places in India and China.
Yeah. No, it becomes less and less detailed. The resolution suffers.
But also, Ptolemy does note that this Makoroba is on the mouth of a river, a wadi.
Yeah. However, when Ian Morris and others did the analysis to remap the coordinate system, what they located was Makoraba here at Al-Mahabisha. Right. This is part of a much longer story south of Najran. And this is Al-Mahabisha here in Yemen. So that's about 720 kilometers south. And if you look at this is the 2nd century map accuracy, it is pretty bad. Italy, I mean, that looks like a limp noodle here. But the detail and the resolution is worse and worse the further you go south and east. So it becomes extremely vague. So this is the problem that we have. You can see this is completely false, when you look at what Italy looks like and so on. So you can't use that as a valid, but remapping the coordinate system puts Mecca in Yemen, according to that remapping. So I'll leave it at that. We should slowly wrap up because I did a lengthy talk on that in the past, but I mean, it might be worth, something to examine again as a panel in the future, go through some of that because there's a lot of overlap that I found with pre-Arabian pagan beliefs. Influences from those prior to, everyone thinks that Islam started in 570 exactly in Mecca and moved north and east, but nothing happened in 569 ever, that could have potentially influenced those people, So
but it would only have, of according to the Islamic tradition, it would have only started in 610, though, when he.
Yeah, but everyone sort of works on the birth of Muhammad, and then before that was a vacuum, you know.
No, but the point is, I would just prefer here that, so when you read the Quran and what have you, as I said, content-wise, also it's rather rich in navigation vocabulary and what have you. But as I said, the Quran clearly comes from Syria, as we mentioned in the first talk, I guess 2 weeks ago. But so with the pilgrimage in Mecca, there are, of course, the problem that was pointed out by Wellhausen in Resten des Arabischen Heidentums, and you find this also in Arabic sources. Our good friend from the Akbar Makkah points out that the tribe in Mecca refused to take part in the pilgrimage rites outside of Mecca. So there is this discrepancy, and Wellhausen in his Resten des Arabischen Heidentums has really worked on this. A big discrepancy in Safa and Marwa and Zamzam, as I said, from the book of Maccabees.
Waking up, Rob. You're breaking up.
We are losing you.
Am I there again?
Yeah, your audio disappeared. Yeah, we should slowly start to wrap up here. And I mean, there's so many alleyways to go down, shall we say? So many paths to explore, and there's just this endless permutation of questions and ideas to, and evidence to present. Yeah. So please try that again, Professor, because your audio disappeared there.
Oh, okay. No, what I pointed out was that if you look in the Arabic sources, they mention that the Khums, the tribe in Mecca, branch of the Quraysh, they refused to participate in the rites outside of Mecca, but only in the rites inside of Mecca. If you look closely at the rites inside of Mecca, they seem to be biblically inspired, as you've discussed, Safa, Marwa.
Well, the word Quraysh, it seems to be a corruption of because they were called the Qureshi, which seems to be a corruption of the Persian Kuroshi, which is from Cyrus. And Cyrus is obviously highly favored in the Bible. So this seems to be Kuroshi, Qureshi. There seems to be very strong.
But without too much imagination, you could also translate it as Farsi. You could make out of the Q a P. You just remove a dot, and then you could also go to Pharisee if you want, without too much trouble. So what the Quraysh are, I don't know. My only remark was that the point is that there seems to be a discrepancy also in the Islamic tradition, and Wellhausen in Resten des Arabischen Heidentums pointed this out long ago, that there's a discrepancy between the rites that take place in Mecca and outside of Mecca. And the rites that take place in Mecca seem to be, somehow biblically inspired, and the rites outside Mecca could be what's left of a pre-monotheistic religious culture.
There's a lot of that stuff I can talk about, but it could be that naming them the Qureshi was to try to make a play on the idea of Cyrus, the Quroshi, and attribute his status in the Bible to that tribe. So there could well possibly be, but that's a discussion, a much longer discussion, I guess, another time.
No.
So guys, should we wrap
up? To say about this. But we leave the Qureshi aside for this conclusion. The conclusion would be let's remember that nothing sedentary could have existed in the Meccan site. So even if there was a shrine or something there, it could only have been a seasonal or temporary occupation.
Yeah, I mean, to have animals
really important.
Yeah. To support animals in agriculture, you would need a river, not a well.
a river or access to fossil water, or a very well organized irrigation system like in Yathrib, with a convenient soil like in Yathrib.
None of which Mecca has.
No.
So,
Yeah, unless they actually managed to find a way to extract water out of sand.
yeah. I mean, this is rocky, salty, crystalline soil. Not soil, rocks. It's not soil.
It's rocks.
You can't do agriculture there.
Yeah, it's very difficult to collect water with such a soil.
I've been in the region. It's dry, semi-desert. It's arid.
I've been there too, but it's let's say the point also that Odon raised, that agriculture is impossible. So the conclusion that the Mecca of the Islamic tradition is sort of a utopia, no place, I think is clear. It's a literary invention and not a real city. I think Odon has raised that point, made that point very well.
Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah, no, I'd agree. There's a serious, but we also are competing against the narrative, which has been obviously, they've poisoned the well, to use a pun here, with false data, which we're fighting uphill against as well.
Yeah, but this thing with hydrology and climate, it's hard evidence.
Yeah,
it doesn't depend on sources and poisoned wells. It's hard evidence.
What I mean, even if the Saudis had drilled under the Zamzam to tap fossil water, well, this is only a recent discovery, and
1970s.
Technologically feasible for, so whatever they were doing in the time when Muhammad was supposed to have lived, they weren't drilling through bedrock to get to fossil water, I don't think.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, well done, Odon. So that was very clear. So I think we have you have established very well that there wasn't water enough to sustain the standard Islamic narrative, and maybe there was something in there, but it would have been a few families at most, and nothing to do with the story that we've been told. So okay, well done.
Yes, another fascinating presentation by Odon. Thank you very much. And with additional comments by others, all very good. Yes, so the poor old Islamic narrative looking very, very sorry for itself.
It does. Shall we pick this up in 2 weeks again, or shall we meet next week and then Robert has a commitment? We can discuss that afterwards.
I won't be here next week, or at least I won't be here with my my beloved cat. I'll be this will be the ICSA conference, the International Quran Studies Association. So I shall be in Vienna this time next week. I don't know if it's possible to join you by my mobile phone. I'll have a look at that.
Right. Well, we can discuss. We can discuss. So yeah, guys, shall we call it a night here? And thank you, Odon. I mean, really fascinating. And Professor Kerr, always interesting perspectives. And there are just too many things we all want to discuss and too many questions we all want to ask. And we're going to need a little time to work through all of this. Yeah.
All right.
JC, any final words?
No, thank you. This has been fascinating. And Odon had another a live show on a French channel the other day, so I look forward when he has the time to do that as well here, because that was very, very cool. So looking forward to the next ones. But thank you. And for people watching, make sure that you like, share, subscribe to all of those wonderful things, because the algorithm doesn't like this topic for some reason. So thank you all.
Okay, goodbye.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So everyone, God bless, and we will see you all very soon. Take care.